Carlos Prates will one-punch Geoff Neal.
Carlos the Nightmare Prates!
Carlos Prates has turned heads. His striking is among the best that it gets.
He is the nightmare of the welterweight division.
Geoff Neal is a good fighter, but I have more skills to move.
One of the fastest rising contenders regardless of division.
To hurt him and knock him out.
He puts guys out.
That fight gonna end by knockout.
He is something else.
Dangerous man.
I'm 100% sure.
Geoff Neal has finishing instincts.
It's going to be high octane, and the odds of the fight and the finish is 100%.
Geoff Neal can stand toe-to-toe with anybody in the division.
UFC 319 is going to be my night. I just got to go out there and I got to show that I could be a champion.
Carlos vs Geoff Neal are set for the main card of UFC 319, and although Geoff has had a lot of success against great fighters and has had a pretty successful career thus far, I'm here to tell you that Carlos Prates will not only beat Geoff Neal, but he'll one-punch him as well. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm JuicyMMA, I make opinionative MMA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. Also, if you're enjoying the videos and want to support the channel, be sure to hit that join button for members only live streams, videos, alongside with other perks as well. But anyways, let's get into it. Ever since joining the UFC, Carlos Prates has done three things that have been perceived very well by fans and by the UFC. The first and most obvious is win. When you look at 2024, Carlos was able to beat Trevin Giles, Charles Radke, The Leech, and Neil Magny all within that year. The other thing that Carlos has been able to do very effectively is put on very exciting performances. All of those fights in 2024 that I just mentioned were all by KO. TKOing Trevin Giles in the second round, TKOing Charles Radke in the first round, The Leech in the second, and Neil Magny in the first. So the other thing that Carlos has been able to do very effectively is put on fun performances, building his name and pushing him throughout the rankings even quicker than normal fighters could. But the last thing that Carlos was able to do really well in 2024 is be very active. As typically when you talk about UFC fighters, they fight maybe once, maybe twice a year, but when you look at what Carlos was able to do in 2024, he fought 4 times that year. And based upon how successful, how entertaining, and how active Carlos Prates was, the UFC decided to give him a pretty big jump up in competition when he went up against Ian Machado Gary. And although Ian controlled the fight for the most part and won in the end, at the end of that 5th round, Carlos Prates was very close to finding a finish. And if he made a couple of different adjustments throughout the fight, there is a good chance that he could have actually found that finish. But a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, why has Carlos Prates been able to be so successful thus far? Well, in my opinion, it comes down to a couple different factors, but the first factor I want to touch upon is his distance management. Now, obviously, when you look at Carlos Prates, there's a couple of things that jump out to you: the power, the speed, the athleticism, but in my opinion, a huge thing that puts everything together is his distance management. When you look at a lot of the fights that he's been in and a lot of the fights where he's found a KO and had a lot of success, he's been able to utilize his distance management perfectly, where he's able to land shots on his opponents, but his opponents can't land shots on him. And when you talk about Prates for the division, he is very tall and he is very long. So utilizing great distance management is always going to be effective, but it's going to be even more effective for a guy like Carlos Prates. But the next reason for why I think Carlos Prates has been able to be so successful thus far is due to his pressure. Now, pressure in an MMA fight is very effective, but the way guys utilize pressure is very different. When you talk about a guy like Khabib Nurmagomedov, he would utilize a ridiculous amount of pressure in order to find takedowns and eventually find a finish. For a guy like Merab Dvalishvili, he utilizes pressure in order to find a bunch of takedowns and tire out his opponents. But Prates utilizes pressure differently. For Prates, what he's trying to do is land big shots, and when he's able to pressure his opponents and push them alongside the cage, it makes it much more difficult for his opponents to move around as much. And when his opponents are more stationary, Prates does have a really good ability to strike and does have a really good ability to line up that big left hand. And if he's able to land that big left hand, he's most likely going to knock you out cold. So I do think the pressure that Carlos Prates does have is a very effective weapon and is a huge reason for why he's been able to be so effective in the striking thus far. But the last reason for why Carlos has been so effective in the UFC thus far is due to his power. Now, everything that I touched upon before, like his distance management and his pressure, sets up his power, but at the end of the day, the fact that Carlos does have so much power really takes his game to the next level. Because unlike other fighters, when Prates lands clean on you, you're most likely going to get KO'd. Because when you look at all the fights that Prates has been able to win thus far, they've all been by walk-off KO. If he's able to land clean on you, the fight is most likely going to be over at that point. So although Prates does do a lot of things out there pretty technically, I think the fact that he has so much power is a huge reason for why he's been able to put everything together and be so successful in the UFC thus far. But another question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, why do I think Carlos Prates is going to one-punch Geoff Neal? Well, in my opinion, it comes down to a couple different factors, but the first factor I want to touch upon is Geoff Neal himself. Because when you watch Geoff Neal out there, he does do a pretty good job at getting on that inside boxing range and landing big bombs. And against a lot of opponents, that is actually pretty effective. But against a guy like Carlos Prates, I think it's actually going to go the other way. I think if Geoff Neal does try to be a little bit over aggressive, get on the inside and land big shots, putting combinations together, that's going to leave a lot of openings for Carlos Prates to land a big counterpunch. And I think if Prates is able to land something big early, it's going to force Geoff Neal to be on the back foot. And as I touched upon before, if Carlos Prates is able to stay on the front foot in this fight and he has Geoff Neal on the back foot alongside the cage, that's usually where he's able to find his finishes. So although the aggression of Geoff Neal has led him to be pretty successful in a lot of his fights, even in his fight against Shavkat Rakhmonov that he did lose, in this specific fight versus Carlos Prates, I think that aggression will be turned around against Geoff Neal. But the next reason for why I think Carlos Prates is going to one-punch Geoff Neal is due to the physicality. Because when you talk about Carlos Prates and Geoff Neal, they both obviously hit very hard, but I think there's a very significant difference within the power between these two guys. For Geoff Neal, he does hit very hard, but mostly what he does well and mostly where he finds his finishes is if he's able to put punches in combination and land a bunch of shots to eventually TKO his opponent. But for Carlos Prates, as I mentioned before, he's usually able to land one big shot that completely puts his opponents out, and he's able to get a bunch of walk-off KOs. So I do believe the power difference, although good for Geoff Neal, is very different between him and Carlos Prates. But even outside of just the power difference, I think the chin difference is also significantly different. As when you look at Carlos Prates out there, although he hasn't fought in too many fights in the UFC, for the most part he has been able to eat a lot of the big shots coming back his way. But for Geoff Neal, although his chin isn't necessarily bad, at the same time there have been a lot of moments throughout his career where he has been hurt pretty significantly. And I do believe if Carlos was able to land one clean shot on Geoff Neal, he'll be able to find a one-punch KO. Whereas if Geoff Neal was able to land one clean punch on Carlos Prates, I'm not so sure he would be able to find a finish, nonetheless even hurt Carlos. So I do think the physicality is significantly different between these two guys. But if I had to give an official prediction for this matchup, I would lean with a Carlos Prates first round KO. As I touched upon before, I am expecting Geoff Neal to be very aggressive in this fight. And within that aggression, I think Carlos can find a counter shot, then be on the gas, be on the pressure, and eventually find a one-punch TKO or KO like he normally is able to do when he's able to find his victories. But assuming Carlos is able to make it past Geoff Neal, I think he's going to quickly rise in the rankings and become once again a legitimate contender at 170 pounds. Although he did lose to Ian Machado Gary, I don't think that's going to hurt him all that much. At the end of the day, I still do think Prates' future is pretty bright, and I think he's going to continue to make his way up throughout the rankings. But I guess only time will tell what does end up happening for Carlos, and also for Geoff Neal for that matter. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think Carlos Prates is going to one-punch Geoff Neal, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.